Rather than sort of just go through the curriculum or talk about things that are easy enough to read on the website, what I wanted to do today is take a slightly bigger picture approach to my remarks and to talk about some terms which we hear a lot, but which I feel that a lot of us don't properly think about what they mean or what they entail. And one of those terms, which you see very frequently these days, is the term classical education. In the current crisis that we're seeing in education, one response, which is certainly praiseworthy, has been a renewed emphasis on classical education. It's become something of a buzzword. You see lots and lots of classical schools, many of which do wonderful work. They've borne rich fruit in the quality of education that they've provided to people. And yet, for many people, both inside and outside of those schools, the meaning of terms such as a classical school and what that entails remains somewhat vague and elusive. Like some of you, I myself was classically educated, um, and perhaps I'm falling into the error of assuming that everyone else shares my own ignorance and shortcomings. But I must confess that throughout the years of my classical education, I think I would have struggled immensely if somebody had asked me what made my education classical or to define that term. Perhaps I'm preaching to the choir here, but nevertheless, I beg your forbearance, and I invite you to spend the next few minutes with me delving into the very rich and vibrant reality behind some of these terms, towards which we have, perhaps maybe just myself, but which I think many people have developed a very casual attitude towards, such as classical. And I want to delve into those terms and sort of get a picture of their full and beautiful identity. So, what is it that makes an education classical? That seems to be a very fundamental question that we should ask ourselves if we are, in fact, striving to either receive or provide a classical education. Well, with my own background as a classicist, to me, classical means ancient Greece and Rome. So, there's got to be more to it than that when we mean classical education. So, I looked it up. I looked up classical education. And what I found was that classical education is education which, quote, takes renewed inspiration from a traditional and historic liberal arts education. Well, that's kind of just kicking the can down the road, isn't it? What is a traditional liberal arts education? That seems to be the underlying question we have to then address if we want to know what classical is. And it's a term which is immensely confused in the modern era. So I want to start off with a little bit of disambiguation. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to the liberal arts, the humanities. Sometimes these terms are simply used interchangeably, um, which has led to a lot of misunderstanding and really a poor representation of what they are. To most people, when they use the term liberal arts, they simply refer to general education studies or to the humanities or just generally to everything that isn't math and science. I think that's the most common sort of use of the phrase you'll come across. So before we delve into what the liberal arts actually are, I want to break down the terms a little bit between these fields of study. So, first off, the humanities are part of the liberal arts, or rather, they are an application of the liberal arts, which we'll come back to. So to think back to geometry class for a moment, all squares are technically rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. So the humanities are all part of the liberal arts, but not all liberal arts subjects are what we consider the humanities. So with that in mind, let's tackle the beast. The liberal arts can be broken down into some very recognizable categories: humanities, natural sciences, mathematics. Yes, some people are shocked to hear that science and math are in fact a part of a liberal arts education. And why is that? Because what a liberal arts education is, what the liberal arts are, is the overarching study of the human experience, including humanities history, the physical world we live in, the natural laws of reality which bind that world. The liberal arts is the study of human experience in all its facets. And the history of this idea of the liberal arts dates all the way back to classical antiquity. Liberal arts stems from the Latin word liberalis, which means appropriate for free men. A liberal arts education was the course of study which was considered proper and essential for free citizens of Rome and of the states of ancient Greece. How best to achieve this education befitting free people has been a topic of acute interest for, well, just about as long as education has existed in the West. In the Christian tradition, such literature goes back to the Church Fathers, Augustine, Boethius, Cassiodorus, Isidore of Seville, all the way through later authors such as the Venerable Bede, Alcuin, Duns Scotus in the Middle Ages. Before them, it is found in many of the pagan luminaries, Cicero and Quintilian. It's been a topic which people have been interested in and engaged with for literal millennia. So that is the liberal arts. We haven't quite got what they are yet, but that's where we're going to find them. The humanities, on the other hand, is something much more specific. So I want to just sort of disambiguate that and get that out of the way. The humanities were born in Renaissance Italy. There were people who really believed in the power and value of literature, specifically ancient literature. They wrote literature in imitation of ancient literature. They studied literature. They packaged and sold literature. They made their whole lives around literature. And they believed that by reading ancient, generally, literature, they could not only gain knowledge about various topics, but they could reshape their own societies and their own lives. They could turn barbarians into civilized people. They could learn how to be powerful, how to be wise, how to be good, how to speak so that your words are convincing, how to make your city peaceful and strong, how to live in harmony with nature, how to essentially reach the pinnacle of human development. And those who studied ancient books for this purpose were said to be engaged in the study of humanity, to distinguish them from those who studied religious books and scripture, which is the study of divinity. So that's what the humanities is. It's a subset of the liberal arts, particularly associated with the Renaissance, but it is not an interchangeable term. The liberal arts are much bigger and broader than the humanities. So, as every school child once knew, there were 7 liberal arts. There were the trivium, the creatively named 3 thing, which is grammar, how to use language, logic, how to evaluate ideas expressed in language, and rhetoric, which is how to convey information and conclusions effectively to other people in language. That forms the foundation of education in the great civilizations of Greece and Rome and Christendom. Following the trivium and building on that foundation, you had the also eminently creatively named quadrivium, the 4th thing, which consisted in arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Together, this program served to equip an educated person to fruitfully engage both with other people and with the natural world around them and its laws. So, as you could see, a wide array of modern subjects are included under the mantle of the liberal arts, varying as widely as psychology, statistics, physics, history, theater, journalism. These are all things which are technically parts of the liberal arts, even though they do not necessarily resemble the original quadrivium and trivium, but we'll get to why that is in a moment. These subjects are all applications of the liberal arts to specific topics. Some of the 7 arts are recognizable to us as subjects in school that we might learn, such as geometry. Geometry is a subject. You can buy a textbook about it. You can memorize its facts and figures. We don't think of that as an art. Others, however, are hard to necessarily define as a subject. They don't have a discrete body of knowledge of which you can become master. They are rather methods for dealing with subjects. So grammar is in one sense, a subject in that it does definitively mean learning a language. For most of the history of the liberal arts, that would mean learning Latin. But language itself is simply a medium in which thought is expressed. The whole of the trivium is in fact intended to teach the pupil not just a body of knowledge, but rather a set of tools of learning, tools which can then later be applied to what we would think of as academic subjects or bodies of knowledge. So, with the trivium, it's pretty easy to trace this trajectory. So you start out with your grammar. You have to learn a language, not just how to order a pizza in Italian, but you have to learn the structure of a language and hence of language itself, how it's put together, how it works. Secondly, by logic, the second part of the trivium, you have to learn how to use language, how to define terms, make accurate statements, conduct arguments, detect fallacies in arguments, either your own or others. And thirdly, the last part of the trivium of rhetoric teaches how to express yourself in language, how to say what you have to say elegantly and persuasively. In an essay on education, the wonderful English novelist Dorothy Sayers called the liberal arts the lost tools of learning. Now, that might seem very applicable, all well and good, for something like grammar. One would find it exceptionally hard to learn anything if you did not have the facility of language in which to learn it. Uh, Less apparent, perhaps, is the application of this principle to the quadrivium. How might we apply this idea of the liberal arts as tools rather than as subjects to something like geometry or astronomy? These very clearly seem to be subjects, bodies of knowledge of which one can become the master. They don't seem to be arts or tools in the way that grammar is. They seem to be sciences. And at first glance, they do indeed appear to be just that, subjects, bodies of knowledge that you can learn. But beneath the surface of these four arts of the quadrivium, what we find is actually that they are a continuation of the trivium as tools, not just to learn a particular topic, geometry. Everyone loves shapes, but it's not just about learning the facts of geometry or the facts of astronomy. It's still about learning how to engage with topics. And we'll see how that works presently. So if the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric gives you the tools for interacting humanely, we might say, that is, with other human beings and human society, the quadrivium, through its four categories, was designed to equip the student to study external reality outside of humanity by familiarizing them with the interaction of number, space, and time. A very necessary and indeed foundational requirement for anything that we would think of as science or scientific inquiry. If you do not have an understanding of number or space or time, it would be very difficult to do anything which we would call science. So arithmetic taught number in the abstract. Geometry taught number in relation to space. Music taught number in relation to time. And astronomy, the study of the heavens, teaches number in relation to both space and time. Of course, this cannot be divorced from the arts of the trivium, since without language and grammar, information could not be formulated. Without logic, it could not be evaluated. And without rhetoric, it couldn't be shared with anyone else. So the arts then aren't exactly subjects in themselves, distinct from scientific subjects as we think of them, but rather they are methods and tools for approaching specific subjects. So, what is the distinction between an art and a science? Well, in the classical tradition, there is a subtle but very real distinction in the history of the liberal arts between an art and a science. A science is simple enough, it comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning knowledge. A science is a body of knowledge that a person might learn and become master of. The way to master a science is simply to discover all the truths about it that you can and to integrate it as far as possible with all the other truths you know. An art is not a body of knowledge, but an ability to produce or to create something, such as knowledge. So, for instance, a person who has mastered the art of architecture will have the ability to design sound and aesthetically pleasing buildings. The person skilled in the art of basket weaving will have the ability to weave excellent and functional baskets. And art is about an ability to do or to make something. It is not primarily about knowing certain things. And this distinction goes all the way back to Aristotle when he defined the intellectual virtue of art as a state of capacity to make something involving a true course of reasoning. Whereas a knowledge or a science is a state of capacity to demonstrate something. In other words, someone who is skilled in the art of blacksmithing has the ability to forge a tool correctly based on prior experience and practice according to the nature of the materials and the needs of the tool. On the other hand, someone who has knowledge or has learned the science of something is able to show or demonstrate that knowledge through reasoning. So somebody who has knowledge of the science of blacksmithing might be able to tell you about the metallurgical content of different alloys and why some are more suitable to others, but it not necessarily has to have the ability to actually make or produce something. The arts are all about application and production rather than simply about knowing certain things. Aristotle's distinction between the intellectual virtues of art and science became a crucial principle in the classical tradition of the liberal arts. However, our modern classical education movement has not always been exemplary at keeping this distinction clear. In its clearest articulation, the seven liberal arts are not subjects, they're not simply bodies of knowledge that you could memorize. Instead, they are skills, highly complex skills that students needed to be trained in over the course of years. Of course, for every art, there is also something of a science, like the science of grammar. There is a body of knowledge about grammar you do need to know. However, knowing the rules of grammar is different than being able to use a language. There is a whole body of truths about the grammar of various languages which one could master and still not actually have the art of that language. There are truths about logical reasoning that one could master without being able to effectively produce an argument. There's a science for every subject that is distinct from its art. So naturally, students of the liberal arts certainly gain knowledge or science of all kinds along the way, especially concerning the particular liberal arts they were studying, just as someone who was learning the art of blacksmithing would also pick up a decent amount of the science. He would learn something of the metals, so he would learn something of the body of knowledge while he was practicing that art. But they are different things. The ability to demonstrate your knowledge of something, say blacksmithing, is not the same thing as your ability to forge a hammer properly. On the other hand, the liberal arts, particularly the trivium, are something of a unique case because the products, so to speak, of the arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric are themselves the communicated products of knowledge, namely reading and interpretation, discussion and reasoning, and spoken or written persuasion. So you can't use the trivium without having the science of something, or you would have nothing to apply those skills to. But the distinction still holds between the ability to make, that is art, and pure knowledge, which is science. And no less important a figure than St. Thomas Aquinas sums it up very nicely when he says, the liberal arts are divided into the trivium and the quadrivium, since by these, as by certain paths, the lively mind enters into the secrets of philosophy. So, this distinction between arts and sciences was important, and it's where we find a clear contrast between modern conceptions of what the liberal arts are and the traditions of the ancient and medieval practice of the liberal arts. I think I can put it no better than Dorothy Sayers herself did when she wrote that although we often succeed in teaching subjects to our pupils, we fail lamentably, on the whole, in teaching them how to think. They learn everything except the art of learning. Thus, an important distinction between modern and medieval education in the liberal arts is this emphasis on subjects and acquiring discrete bodies of knowledge versus forging and learning to handle the tools of learning that can be applied to any body of knowledge. So, based on this distinction from Aristotle to Aquinas, it seems to make the most sense to think of the liberal arts as something very different than just subjects that you could memorize. They are paths, they are well worn paths, they are complex habits, they are the tools of learning that can't simply be memorized and reproduced on a test. They need to be lived, they need to be ingrained over repetition and practice over a long period of time. They are the skills needed to discover and to justify knowledge in any area, in any body of knowledge. So, this leads us to a twofold understanding of what the liberal arts are. Each is both an art and a science, both a complex skill of communication and a body of knowledge about the topic. This is perhaps easiest to see if we once again return to my favorite example of blacksmithing. So imagine two different people who claim to be experts on blacksmithing. One of them knows the whole history of smithing. He can name all the most important blacksmiths throughout history. He can describe key changes in metal alloying. He can describe different cultures' use of blacksmithing. He has theories about why blacksmithing developed as it did in certain places at certain times. But unfortunately, he has never actually smithed anything. He is someone who is a master of the science of blacksmithing. He knows the information, he knows the knowledge, but he doesn't have the art. The other person has never heard of any way of forging a tool other than the way that he was taught by his father. And yet he makes tools every day that work and that function. The first person is wise in the science of blacksmithing, while the second is versed in its art. Of course, these are rarely completely discrete. Many artists come to know something of the science, and many scientists have a rudimentary practice of the art that they learn about. So there are bodies of knowledge about these arts that one can master. One can become a grammarian and learn the science of grammar instead of simply practicing its art as you do when you use language. You can study the philosophy of logic. Some amount of study in these sciences can certainly help one to master the arts, just as some knowledge of the history and development of blacksmithing may indeed be useful to the blacksmith and make him a better practitioner of his art. On the other hand, someone could be a powerful public speaker without any study on the history or science of rhetoric, based on a combination of talent, imitation, and practice. So this forces those of us who educate to ask this question: what are we aiming for with a liberal arts education? If you look at many modern textbooks in grammar or the other liberal arts, you have to admit that the method of the textbook seems to assume that the primary goal is simply to teach students a body of knowledge about a subject, that is, a science, as if that were enough, as if that were all there is to do. This is to treat the liberal arts as sciences, which they are not. Now, don't get me wrong here, science is a very good thing, and it can be helpful, especially if fused with the appropriate art. However, the sciences can be deadening if they are learned in the absence of training in the arts. So there's a reason in the Western tradition that the liberal arts were the foundation upon which you had to start before one could study the sciences. So this is not a brand new problem in the world of liberal arts education. All the way back in the 17th century, the British philosopher John Locke laments that there can scarce be a greater defect in a gentleman than not to express himself well, either in writing or in speaking. But yet I think I may ask my reader whether he does not know a great many men who live upon their estates, and so, with the name, should have the qualities of gentlemen, who cannot so much as tell a story as they should, much less speak clearly and persuasively in any business. This I think not to be so much their fault as the fault of their education. So, people have been lamenting the state of the liberal arts for a very, very long time. Nevertheless, it's a haunting warning that I think we would do well to heed in order that our schools don't fall prey to this same fault. We might be training young ladies and gentlemen who can spout off the right answers, but do not, in fact, have the ability to think, speak, and write, who have not, as Dorothy Sayers would say, acquired the lost tools of learning, the liberal arts. So the path forward for the liberal arts and the path that has guided the development of the teaching and curriculum here at the Collegium is based on the idea that the liberal arts can't be reduced to a series of incredibly boring textbooks filled with facts and answers which students will memorize and promptly forget. On the other hand, we ought not to ignore the value of the science of any topic in its technical sense, that body of knowledge. There can, and indeed, for the future of the liberal arts, there must be a harmonious union of training in the liberal arts, understood in the traditional sense, and instructions in subjects or bodies of knowledge, as the liberal arts have become known in modern times. And this is the key to the educational program at the Collegium. Training students in the liberal arts, those tools of learning and engaging with the world around them, with their fellow human beings, and with God's creation, by means of specific subjects, imparting a body of knowledge which is timeless, valuable, and integral to a well-formed Catholic mind while learning that art. This is the guiding principle that shapes our practice here at the Collegium. As we train students in the arts, they obtain knowledge of the foundational elements of Western Christian civilization, the scriptures, the rich theological and musical patrimony of the church, and the natural sciences. We're really seeking to carry on the tradition of the medievals in approaching the arts as not simply bodies of knowledge, but rather tools and practices which can be learned through the study and teaching of different bodies of knowledge, but which are not synonymous with it. And so what we're striving to do is to produce students who, yes, on the one hand, do have knowledge. They have certain knowledge. They'll know the scriptures. They'll know the history of Western civilization, the beautiful and glorious history of our church. But on the other hand, they'll have the ability to engage equally well with other bodies of knowledge and other topics as they so choose. That's really the goal, not just to give them a bunch of information, but rather to teach them how to go out there and apply themselves fruitfully to whatever it is they want to end up doing, whatever body of knowledge they seek to attain. We seek to give them the tools to do that while also grounding them well within the Western and Catholic tradition of education.